Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar brought to you by Mix It Up. My name is Michelle Allison, and I'm the Associate Publisher of Top Crop Manager. This is the first of 3 resistance management webinars that we're hosting, and today I'm joined by Liz Simpson, Canola Agronomic Systems Manager with Bayer. Today during our session, Liz will discuss the benefits of pre-seed tank mixing in relation to yield and resistance management, touching on topics such as how to set yourself up for tank mixing success and the importance of delaying resistance on your farm. Special thanks to Mix It Up by Bayer Crop Science for sponsoring our session today. From seed to harvest, Bayer is focused on delivering top-performing solutions to address some of your toughest farm challenges. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. The session is scheduled to run for approximately 45 minutes, and following Elizabeth's presentation, we'll open the floor to questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them into the questions tab found on the GoToWebinar panel on your computer screen. This webinar has been approved for 1 CCA-CEU credit in crop management. Further instruction for submissions will follow the presentation if you did not already submit your CCA number when you registered for today's webinar. Without further ado, I will let Elizabeth take it away from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. Talking about early season weed control and tank mixing is actually quite a big passion of mine in terms of the best opportunity to work through some weed management. So I will have a slide advancer, so I will be asking Andrew to advance my slides for me. We'll go next. So let's go over what I want to go over today. Really talking about the benefits of early season weed control first, the advantages of going in that pre-seed timing or very early post-seeding to the farm and to our weed control, to our crop yield, and then to our resistance management. Because really when we're focusing on these best management practices to get that better control and better yield, a lot of these practices include some really strong resistance management practices. So we'll go through these 3 things throughout this presentation. Next. A lot of things that we're thinking about usually early season, and a lot of the ways that we talk ourselves out of doing some early season spraying is usually the thought that, maybe more weeds are coming and I'll just wait to get them all. Or it seems really strange to me to spray the ground when there's nothing there. And another thing that we always think about is we spray weeds because they're competing for nutrients and water and sunlight, but there's not even a crop in there yet per se, or it's really tiny. Like, what's the point in that if we're trying to save for these competition reasons? And the other thing is, like, I just put this crop in the ground. I don't really want to do this again, have another pass. So typically this is when we wait or we're delaying our spraying practices, and we're not really putting in that full effort into this opportunity for early season spraying. So we'll go through some of these and explain maybe why that's not the right way of thinking, and it's a little counterintuitive, but there's a lot of research and a lot of reasons why we should be thinking otherwise. Next. We'll start with the easy ones. Honestly, small weeds are easier to control. So when we're going in there, pre-seed, burn-off time, the smaller the weed, the more efficacy we're going to get out of that herbicide. Younger weeds tend to be more susceptible to herbicides than older weeds. In case of contact herbicides or one that doesn't really translocate to a great degree, they're generally less effective on larger weeds because there's more leaves, more foliage to deal with, right? So you're not actually getting to the growing points that you need to get or getting enough coverage on it. So it's an opportune time when these weeds are smaller to actually fully kill them with a herbicide. And that plays really well when we start talking about a zero tolerance to when we're looking at potentially herbicide-resistant weeds. So having that efficacy in the beginning is huge. We'll go to the next slide. I just wanted to show, and again, an example. This is with glyphosate on wild buckwheat, but just the size difference that the control, size in the weeds that the herbicide control changes, right? So I'm not larger, over 10 leaf, which is not, an uncommon size out there. Having that half a liter an acre of glyphosate on it, you don't really get full control. But in that free leaf, you can be very confident that you don't have to worry about that weed moving forward into the season. Well, next slide. And again, just to put the numbers to it in terms of our weed control, past those visuals, we're seeing a 20% to a 10% increase in weed control when we are targeting some of those smaller weeds. So the earlier we can get in there and actually target those weeds, the less likely they are to grow through. We know we're going to get a much higher percentage kill. 98% is phenomenal, right? So when we move towards that, that's what we're looking for. Next slide. In this case, I really like this visual just to look at the kinds of weeds that we're controlling in that pre-seed burn, and sometimes you don't necessarily see it because they are small, but doing some of these bare ground pre-seed application trials just to get an understanding or a feel of what those weeds could look like if you were to leave them to grow through and what that actual population was. So in this case, we're looking at a residual pre-seed application of dicamba and Roundup. Taking advantage of a residual herbicide tank mix. This could be done pre-seed. There was no crop in this one, so there is no crop competition. But this is a month between applications. And you can see it might have been sprayed a little late, but that month, that's not really unreasonable from a spring spraying to maybe that time that you can actually get in there for your first application. And if you hadn't done any weed control earlier on, you would be left with all of those weeds on the left side of this picture. And those would be out of stage to spray with something like a glyphosate. And basically any chemistry in any crop that you're dealing with, those are quite large wild buckwheat and roundleaf mallow that's in that field. So the opportunity to go in when they're small and not have to worry, because this, you would expect some potential escapes if that was the size of weeds you were dealing with in crop. And not only, this is a bare grounds trial, but if you were in crop, you'd have some covering, some of the crop would be covering, so you'd have to deal with a lot more foliage to get that coverage. So taking advantage of the coverage that you get from doing early season. We'll go next. And again, this one just really drives that home for me of that the weed potential in this field and how we can manage that such early on in the season, and how those residual chemistries really do hold on and can add a lot of value as you go through the season. So if we did have a crop in here, we have lots of opportunities with cereals and corn and dicamba soybeans to have that residual early, adding some crop competition into that field. And what you're looking at, you might not need a second pass if you've done such a good job in that early season weed control and not having to deal with that potential competition. And this is a giant mess, but if you were to look at the left side, you would not be able to control any of these weeds as you go forward too. So just making sure that your applications are as effective as possible. Next. And to drive that home when we're looking at the residual control, it's not just keeping that population down and controlling the small ones, but there really is a yield benefit to having that. So when we were looking at some of these trials with the dicamba pre-seed and having that residual control, and this is an example from the Extend Bean system, but we do see, about a 2 bushel yield advantage to having a very solid pre-seed spray program with a residual mixed herbicide. 2.4 bushels over 7 years and 39 field trials is what they found. And that really has nothing to do with the chemistry itself. It has everything to do with the agronomics of spraying early, and having a residual is getting those extra 2 bushels. So we'll go to the next slide. So that's something I'd really like to start with, and we can wrap our heads around. The value to your crop of having that early season weed control and where those bushels are coming from. It's not necessarily anything to do with the chemistries themselves. It can be with that residual, but the whole point is having that clean field at the exact right time that your crop needs it to. So we've gone from making sure that we can control those weeds to having those weeds controlled at the exact right time for your crop. Next, please. And this is when we get into these concepts of critical timing of weed removal, critical weed-free period, and then combining those to the critical period of weed control. I think these terms have been usually thrown around quite loosely, but really going into the concept of this weed interference. So when we look at the critical timing of weed removal, we're thinking about when do we need to take this, when do we need to put in an application to kill these weeds so that we're saving yield. And this the little curve that you see going through my nice little crop is the yield potential. So saying starting at 100%, the longer we leave these weeds in, you're losing more and more yield. So the key takeaway from this one is that yield loss happens pretty much instantly with most crops and goes down from there, and then it does level off, right? And so we're looking at, what point on the top of that curve, when in this crop season do we need to start removing these weeds? And that's when we talk about critical timing for weed removal, that's what we're talking about. So if we go to the next slide, critical weed-free period is similar but different. So what we're looking at on this one, if we can see our crop as we go, is really at what stage in our crop can weeds re-enter into the field and not actually cause yield damage. So the way that we look at this curve is basically, at the beginning of the season, if you were to let your weeds take off, from cotyledon or first trifoliate, your yield damage is the highest, whereas there is a point in our older, more mature parts of the crop where the yield isn't affected by the weeds that are coming in, and that doesn't really matter on the density, it's more on the crop staging. So when we put this together to really talk about it, we'll go to the next slide. This is what we mean when we talk about the critical period of weed control, is the time when weeds need to be removed. So if there was a time early in its lifespan where it could handle, or what time you need to start weed removal, and then what time you can stop. Because a lot of what's happening in this early season crop stage, when they are coming up against weeds, is what we call weed interference, where these small plants are actually setting their yield potential for the rest of the season while they're 1, 2, 3 leaf plants, and essentially receiving environmental signals around them saying that there are too many weeds and you're going to have to compete for resources. So alter the way that you're growing, we're going to have less yield potential. We might need to grow taller, we might need to have wider leaves. All of these things is what I like to think of it as the plant's basically deciding what it has the capacity to do. So not even competing necessarily for these resources, but the potential to have to compete for these resources is what actually can cause our yield damage. So when we actually get out of that stage, if there are some weeds, but when this crop is taken off and it's nice and large and mature and can outcompete, it's usually not an issue in terms of yield damage. The yield damage that we do is quite early on. So even if we do spray these weeds out later on, if we miss that window, we're still going to see a yield damage from those weeds, even if they're gone by the end of the year. So really starting to think about the vulnerable stage of our crops being a lot earlier than we're used to. And it's a little counterintuitive because you'd expect them to be, later when they're pod filling. Maybe that's important. That's when they need the most resources, but they're actually setting their yield potential based on the environmental signals they're getting around them early on. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. When we do define these critical periods of weed control, we kind of set whatever would be an economical threshold of yield loss that is going to pay for your chemistry or have that line across, and that's when we put the start and finish to the beginning and the end of this critical period of weed control. And this is what we'd say: there should be no weeds within this window to keep this yield. So that means, if we look at this one, it starts at cotyledon stage. We need to have the weeds removed before then so that the entire window is free of weeds. If we go to the next slide. There has been lots of work done on most crops trying to define the critical period of weed control. Depending on the year, depending on the region, it does vary a little bit, but the moral of the story is it's usually from emergence to, say, 4-leaf in corn, emergence to second, third trifoliate in soybeans. Canola would be emergence to that 6-leaf stage, and wheat is that 1 to 3 leaf stage in there. So a lot earlier than I think that we're used to thinking about when that critical weedy time is. A lot of the times we'll wait until that crop is 4-leaf before we even go look back into corn to do some weed control. And certainly wheat, we don't necessarily consider it super vulnerable in the very beginning of its season, and it's not the ideal time to go in with some in-crop chemistries. But there is a key point to having this weed-free when these plants are coming up and out of the ground. Next slide, please. And we can see that in a lot of the yield studies as well. So this one is such a huge example that I like to show it, because if you look between the weed check and the weed free check, this is in corn in eastern Canada, so spraying, not spraying at all, there's 100 bushel difference, which is huge. There's not a lot when we're making decisions on the farm or making recommendations that can get you 100 bushels or twice as much yield. There's no new variety that can do that amount of yield advantage or any other wrong step, I think, other than potentially fertility, that can take away that much yield. So it's pretty, I like to think of weed control as still a bit of an unsung hero in terms of how much yield you can get from doing this right. And the fun part is, you're already doing it. We just need to, once we dial in the timings, there's huge advantages to just getting it at the right time. And you can see on this one, this is the last Roundup application. So this is when they let the weeds come back into the crop. So these fields were starting clean, and then for this one treatment, they let the weeds re-enter at the 2-leaf stage, and you can see that there's a yield damage, that 165 bushels, versus letting the weeds come back in that 6-leaf stage and no longer controlling anything. Is basically your high-end yield potential for the corn. So you can see the huge value into that early season and making sure that 2 and 4 leaf should have weed control. Next slide, please. And corn itself is a lot more sensitive than most of the other crops that we deal with, where it's even concerned about the size of the weed at the time of the herbicide application. So you need to go in early, and if the weeds are larger, there is another yield penalty for that as well. So those, at that weed free, that 200 bushels at a 10 centimeter plant or weed, there's a little bit of a yield drop, but once you go to that 30 centimeter size plant or weed, it's causing a lot of yield drop. So when we looked at earlier with some of those residuals and the potential size of of a weed, even from, pre-seed to a month in, those weeds can get to quite large and to be that size and causing that much damage, especially if you have some biennials or perennials that are already overwintering through your field. You want to make sure you can get them while they're as small as possible because they can take off quite quickly. Next slide, please. And again, soybeans, same thing. This is also another great slide just to show the yield impact that we can make on early season control. And then really, once we've done that early season control and you've done a very good job, the crop does a lot of the work for us afterwards. So potentially, if you've done everything right and it's really established and it's starting to spread, you can start to see that you might not need to go in there and do any extra weed application. So maybe that second pass isn't necessary once you've done a very strong first pass. So this picture for weed removal in Manitoba is a soybean plot. Again, just to show the same. This is for soybean or weed removal, just to show the same how that crop actually looks when you do those late season weed removals. So the first two are V1 and V2. So that's when the first round of herbicide application was gone into to take away that weed pressure, and it was waited until V3, V4, and the beginning of flowering on some of these other strips. And you can just see how set back that crop is from waiting and from having to compete or sit beside that amount of weed pressure as you go. So you can see that they're not only smaller, they're set back. There's going to be a maturity difference on them, and they're not going to. So V3 isn't that uncommon to spray in sometimes, and that crop there in the middle of those pictures isn't going to do a lot for you in terms of out-competing and covering those rows and stopping any other weeds from flushing up after a rain or something like that. But the V1 and the V2 strip that you can see that had that early season weed removal are very competitive, and it's covering the rows, and you have very low chance of new weeds coming up through that crop canopy, whereas the later you left it, the more holes, the less ability that plant has to compete. You're also creating an opportunity for more weeds to come into that space. So next slide, please. So that's really what I wanted to talk about in terms of like the yield benefit that we can see from timing this right, and how we're working with the crop stage when it is the most vulnerable to weed interference and to weed sizing, can really help us increase our yield just from timing alone. So I think we can agree that spraying early is very helpful for our crop. And then the next thing we need to think about as we go through that is then, what is the best thing to spray? What kind of mixtures are we working with? And once we go into some of these valuable mixtures, it really plays in well to resistance management as you go forward. Next slide. So when we're talking about herbicide resistance management, we'll go through this in kind of three buckets of understanding and knowing how resistance develops in your field, and that actually gives you a good indication of, again, the timing and what we want to be targeting and why, based on how resistance is happening in your field. What we can do about it, so we'll talk about tank mixes and spicing it up and making sure that everything's working and everything's working towards the same goal, essentially. And then what else can we do in terms of not thinking about it just this spring, but all of the options that we can do in, say, a 3 or 5 year plan. We'll go to the next slide. So just understanding and knowing about this herbicide resistance plan or how it develops in the field is very useful to how we're going to work on this management plan. Go to the next slide. So the basics on how resistance develops is that this is a simple high-level explanation with some pictures, and we'll go through the field version too. But again, showing these little green weeds are regular standard run-of-the-mill weeds. That little red one will be potentially the first resistant biotype, and it's not showing up because it was sprayed. That one weed, that potential resistant weed, is going to randomly show up within a population of weeds. It's more of the luck of the draw in terms of a genetic lottery, really, that it won. And the only reason we'll ever know that it was herbicide resistant or its DNA has changed to be that way is by spraying it with a herbicide, and it's going to be the only one that survives. So it happens to be in that plant population, kind of 1 in a million, potentially 1 in billions, and it survives. So if we sprayed a single herbicide on here, we've selected for that one herbicide resistant plant to survive. And it's going to be really happy because it's hanging out by itself. All of its competition is gone and setting seed to go back into the next year. So presumably this one is going to make it to maturity, set more seed, continue on. So that the next time or the next year when these weeds are coming up, all of those seeds that we just let come through the last year are now here, still with that general resistant population as well. And again, we've selected for these resistant weeds to now set more seed and keep going. And eventually these plants are become resistant. And eventually they'll take over that population because we keep selecting for them. So essentially by this single herbicide application, we're Darwinian experience selecting for herbicide resistant weeds. So if we go to the next slide. You can see how this would slowly snowball over a few years. And this depends really on the types of resistance that we're developing, the types of weeds, how prolific of a seed setter it is, if it's outcrossing a lot, what kind of seed movement is. So this time frame can happen very, very quickly or very, very slowly depending on our situations. But you can see how, that one weed that we let by slowly over time is going to overtake that population. And there's this feeling that, okay, if, it took me 3 or 4 years to get here, if I don't spray this herbicide for 3 or 4 years, potentially my population will go back down to that resistant. Unfortunately, unlike some other resistance examples that we've seen, like insects or other things, there's not typically a fitness cost to having a resistant biotype out there. So that population, year 5, is still going to set seed for the next 2 or 3 years if it's allowed to escape, even with a different herbicide, and you'll still have that resistant population essentially going forward. It doesn't typically, especially when we're looking at wild oats or something like glyphosate-resistant kochia, these populations never really revert back to a susceptible population, even if we're not continuing with that same selection pressure. So unfortunately, it's not like, oh, I'll spend 3 years to get there and I can spend 3 years trying to fix it. By not spraying, we really need to manage and making sure that none of these resistant biotypes, anything in red, ever actually gets to set seed. So that's our goal, is to make sure no matter what we're doing and what we're spraying, that these potential resistant biotypes never set seed, so we're not snowballing into this full population of resistant biotypes. So our goal, essentially in year 1, we're probably all in the year 2, year 3 stage for some things out there, is to make sure having the concept of zero tolerance, so not letting any of these potential biotypes set seed, which means essentially we need close to 100% weed control, especially on our concerned target weeds. So if we're in an area where kochia is one of our biggest problems, then we need to think of each one of these coaches being a potential red resistant biotype in the field and how to control it, or if it's wild oats, or if it's cleavers, or something else that has the potential to change populations, or something new that we haven't thought about. Whatever that driver weed is, that's your biggest concern, is making sure that it's controlled every time. The next slide. So looking at that and seeing how we can select very quickly for a resistant population is why we're saying relying on one single herbicide puts it at risk, because if we keep on creating that selection pressure like that without having that zero tolerance, it's very quickly going to become ineffective. Glyphosate is one of the least likely to become here, but because of its use pattern, has gotten to that point where there are resistant weeds already, right? So putting and relying on any one herbicide to be your go-to weed control for whatever weed population you're looking at, or at any single timing, can put a lot of pressure on that herbicide and eventually will become ineffective. So essentially, whatever your favorite herbicide is, it shouldn't go alone, because it's at risk if you keep going to that same herbicide. So next slide. So speaking of people's favorite herbicide, when we look at glyphosate use in Western Canada, the majority of it goes down pre-seed. I think it's the difference between 60 million rels and 16 million rels going in crop versus the 60 million going pre-seed. So the majority of glyphosate that we use, we like to put it pre-burn. So pre-seeding is when we like to use the majority of our glyphosate. Typically, because you can go on all of your acres, have that pre-burn. If you are doing a pre-burn residual, it seems like the easy go-to, and it gets all of your weeds. So it seems like, why wouldn't you do that as your go-to plan? However, if we look at the risk associated with having a single herbicide doing all of that work at that single timing, the majority of our glyphosate is actually going down without a tank mix. So it is the standalone herbicide for this time period. And there's no crop competition helping some of that weed control. It is the sole form of weed control is generally glyphosate in the springtime. And you can see over the years, it's slowly getting better. And I think we're at 29% in 2019 that we had a tank mix in addition to glyphosate. But for the most part, more than 2/3, or around 2/3 of our glyphosate is going down without anything in it. So that is the most vulnerable time for this herbicide and the most vulnerable application method if we go forward. So really want to call this one out, that it is a big risk. We'll go to the next slide. Again, looking at the usage patterns, cereals is a little bit, there are more tank mixes that are going pre-seed. I think there's a little bit more option for residual control mix-in, so that's likely why it's more popular. There's a few more enticing options for tank mixes. And that kind of thought process of what else can you control and how much longer into your cereals. Canola, oilseeds, very, very little has a tank mix ahead of time. And there's lots of good opportunities that we'll go through of what you could tank mix and what it can control in addition to. So I see this as a huge opportunity, or a place that we can add basically a single action into our farm management practice by simply adding that tank mix, where we can bring down that vulnerability of creating herbicide resistance for glyphosate in the springtime. So it's a key opportunity, and it's really not a big shift into what we've been doing. So that's spice up your mix, is making sure that we have another effective mode of action in the tank. And so we'll keep going. And again, we talked a little bit earlier about, using that one herbicide and having the thought that maybe if we just stop spraying that herbicide for a year or two, that might be an effective way of creating some herbicide resistance management and preventing herbicide resistance. But again, it's a little bit counterintuitive that moving away from a herbicide doesn't actually prevent you from gaining herbicide resistance on your farm. And we'll go through some research that shows that. We'll go to the next slide. So when we talk about effective modes of action, understanding what effective modes of action means. So when we say that term, we're talking about two modes of action in a herbicide that can kill the same weed on its own. So 2,4-D controlling volunteer canola, Roundup controlling volunteer canola, having something that works on the weed. So kochia, we'd go group 14, group 9, if it's susceptible to group 9 or group 11. Something that can kill it on its own right, but mixed with something else that has the same efficacy on it too. So in cereals, the group 6 and group 27 mixes are very common, or is very strong because they both generally have the activity on the same weeds and are very complementary in terms of that. So something like buckwheat, right? And this depends on your weed spectrum and on your target weed. So it's very important to know what your biggest problem weed is in the field and what is that population that might be a risk to herbicide resistance, or what is on the list coming through that has been herbicide resistant reported within your region recently. And we could have gone into the list of what's coming for herbicide resistant weeds and the potential pressure and the potential issues, but I think we've seen that a lot. And I think focusing now on what's just a good general practice to start doing, whether you have or don't have herbicide resistant weeds on your farm, the actions are quite the same. And then really the next thing would be to understand your herbicide groups to make sure that that both of these groups that you're putting on there is an effective herbicide towards that. So if we're mixing a group 1 and a group 9, that's not necessarily, that's a tank mix, and that's effective on our wild oats and our grassy weeds, but that's not necessarily it's not an effective tank mix on some of our broadleaf weeds or any of our broadleaf weeds. And the one to keep in mind is group 2, because that can go either way depending on which herbicide you're using. So it's very important to know that just because there are multiple chemistries per se, they're not necessarily both effective on that same target weed. So we'll be talking about tank mix herbicide opportunities with those different modes of action, and it can also be achieved sequentially throughout the season if you have to do an application of one group and then going back in with a different group at a closer timing. So again, the goal with this one is to make sure no matter what you do, that none of these weeds make it to maturity and set seed. So that zero tolerance thought. So when we think sequentially, we still plan to make sure that weed is completely controlled by the end of the season. Next slide. And so this is that the mixtures work best. It's a study, which I guess was a while ago now, from 2009, but I think it really is a simple and elegant way to show how effective tank mixes are and how we might be having that false sense of security when we talk about herbicide rotation. So in this study, what they did was basically take a herbicide-resistant population of stinkweed and seed it out over 4 years. And they did a couple of different herbicide applications. So what they did is they made the stinkweed population, it had 2% resistance to a group 2 herbicide within that population. So that's what they started at year 1. And then some of the different treatments that they did was never using a group 2 herbicide ever for the next 4 years, using a group 2 herbicide mixed with bromoxynil, so group 6, bromoxynil and CPA, so group 6, so group 2 and a group 6, and they did that every year for those 4 years, the same tank mix over those 4 years. And then they used a group 2 herbicide 1 out of every 4 years. So I think that's the common, that was our first step when we started talking about herbicide resistance is the concept of rotating a herbicide out. So that would be an example of, 1 in 4 years would be considered a herbicide rotation. And what they found was using that group 2 herbicide every year with a tank mix partner essentially got you the same amount of resistant seeds after the end of 4 years as never having sprayed another group 2 herbicide again. So when we look at that first example, the percent weed seed resistance after 4 years was still at that 2% because we weren't selecting for that resistance. So that population just kept going and kept repeating itself for the next 4 years. So no selection pressure whatsoever, and it stays at that 2%. But when we did the group 2 plus that group 6, the percentage of the population was 3% resistant to group 2s by the end of that 4 years, which statistically in this study was no different than having never used that group 2 herbicide. Because if you think about this, for the 98% of susceptible ones, we were killing it with both that group 2 and that group 6. And then for that 2% of the population that the group 2 no longer worked at, the group 6 was still effective in preventing any more, at killing that plant and preventing any more selection pressure or weed seed generation. Versus when we just used that group 2 1 out of every 4 years, we still had 1 year to give enough selection pressure that it increased the percentage of weed seed resistance to almost 60% of that population by the end of 4 years. So just having the one standalone application increased it all the way up to 60%, which is huge. If we're thinking about that in a field situation, we would basically write the field off as saying it is resistant to this. So having that, if we have concerns or if we have a particularly vulnerable herbicide or something that we're using, to think of it as a rotation and just moving it to every other year or 1 in 4 years is not necessarily an effective method of control. When they did this and they used the group 2 herbicide every year for 4 years, I think it was like 98% resistant. So it is a step. It was the first step in thinking about how we manage our herbicide-resistant weeds. It did bring it down, I guess, from 100. But having that tank mix is essentially as effective as never spraying that to prevent that selection. So next slide, please. So really understanding when we talk about that multiple modes of action has to happen every year with those herbicides that we're talking about, instead of thinking about it as rotating this herbicide once every 4 years. So want to hit that home, that the multiple modes of action, the spicing up your mix, having a few more things in that tank to make sure that you're controlling those weeds in season is key to the success. And a lot more work has been done on this, and doing a few modeling simulations about how this would build out in herbicide resistance in different over time, using different rotational things, using different strategies, and they keep coming back to having this tank mix is the most reliable next step to really ensuring that there is no increase in this resistant populations or creating any herbicide resistance, right? So versus that rotational concept. Next slide. So again, to hit it home one more time, a tank mix at least once per growing season, especially when you're talking about your your target weeds and potentially your most common herbicide or the most powerful herbicide, or the herbicide you need to work the most, to make sure that it's not going down without that tank mix partner, to make sure that there's something in there to kill that weed, even if one is potentially resistant to it. So having those multiple options. And as we start to think about herbicide resistant weeds that we know of, if we know that this is part of our farm and we're dealing something with herbicide resistant kochia, with glyphosate resistant kochia, we're up to 3 tank mixes, right? So we know if group 9 isn't effective, you still need 2 effective modes of action in there. So 14 and 15 or 6, something in there too, so that we're not selecting for the next level of herbicide resistance either. So if we know one's not effective because it's resistant, we need to start going into more mixes. So that's why it's more valuable to prevent and do this with 1 or 2 tank, or 2 tank mixes or something like that, versus once we know we have resistance, we need to start upping our game even more. And again, especially when we talk about herbicides going down by themselves or as part of a rotation, and that common misconception is when you think that you're having a herbicide tolerant trait, and you're rotating it. So say it's a Roundup Ready crop or a Liberty crop or something like that, where you think that you're just going to rotate the crop through, and having that as the basis of your weed control program, you still end up just rotating that herbicide once every 4 years or something like that. So it's not really the safest way to consider your management program, and just switching the trait systems in crop isn't very effective. And a lot of what we need to think about is that pre-seed program and how we think about our crops on a 2 or 3 year plan. So next slide. So there are a phenomenal amount of options, and we'll go through this again when we start thinking about crop rotation. But for every crop, and you can see this is just a light list of some of our partners that we work with that we have on here. There are a lot of different trade names, different actives, different versions of some of these potential tank mixes that you can mix in. And these are all for pre-seed. So what can go in front of canola that doesn't have residual concerns in crop. Some of the stuff through cereals that you can actually gain some advantages to having some residual, same thing with soybeans. There are lots of options. And this is by no means extensive, but to not have something in a tank mix pre-seed is a miss because we have so many options. Next slide. And then the last bucket that we want to hit home on when we're starting to talk about herbicide resistance management and how we're thinking about this is the crop rotation. And we'll say diversify your crop rotation, but really it's thinking in that 3 to 5 year plan of how we want to do this and what our options are across the field. We'll move to the next slide. And how what we do in our rotational system actually does affect how our weeds are responding or acting in this plant too. So if we are weeds can become resistant to not only herbicides but to practices, right? So if you are tilling the same time every spring, odds are in a few years you'll find that your wild oats are emerging a week after your typical tillage timing, just because weeds outsmart habits and not systems, and essentially that tillage is selecting for early season emerging wild oats, and if you keep doing the exact same thing every time, you've selected for later season wild oats to emerge because you've tilled out the early stuff. So eventually you start shifting a population that way too. So these are pretty clever, and it's how we keep things going in that system and how we time things. So the more opportunities that we have to break up a timing or to not be doing everything the same every year, the less likely there is for something to overcome that, right? Because it's not predictable, it's not slowly moving population or slowly selecting. So even when we think about our different crops and the different times that we're in there, and if we have to do tillage ahead of time, or if we're seeding our peas 2 or 3 weeks earlier than we would have seeded our canola wheat rotation, having that timing in there differently, having a crop in there, maybe 3 or 4 weeks up before you would normally have a different crop coming up and covering those rows, is a phenomenal way to shake up that system and to move some of those selection pressures around. And even when we're talking about harvest timing, and especially if you can get into winter wheat or silage, anything like that, where you're really moving around the timings of your activities in the field, can be a huge advantage. And then even the practices that were required within this crop. So this is a pretty powerful picture. This is in Eastern Canada. Both soybean growers, these are neighbors. And you can see on the right-hand side, it is covered in glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed, is all the green in there. And on the left, basically nothing. One plant that probably has sneaked its way through the neighbor. And this is a great example of 2 different rotational practices. So, you can guess that on the right was a continuous Roundup Ready soybean field, 8 years with the same practices, at least 2 applications of Roundup every year. You're guaranteed for that wreck, right? So all of that herbicide is going down on its own without a tank mix. Essentially, the timings were probably exactly the same for those 8 years in terms of when you were seeding, when you were harvesting, when you were spraying. Nothing to shake it up, no diversity in there whatsoever. On the left side was a grower with a proper crop rotation, and this is, I'd say, a smaller crop rotation than we expect in the West, because the majority of it is still corn and soybeans, in a Roundup tolerant corn and soybeans, but as well as having winter wheat in there as well. And this grower is consistent with using tank mixes, pre-burn, and what you can add into corn and soybeans in crop. There are a few options, and essentially working on that zero tolerance and keeping things weed-free, and having that diversity into the system too. Different herbicides in there, having winter wheat in there, having some tillage practices, and you can see it pays off. And what your practices, what your fields look like, really do reflect your entire rotation practices, not just the actions that you're taking the year of. It's a long-term plan and it's long-term actions, but it does pay off. And you can think of, in Western Canada, we have a lot more crops that we can work with in terms of diversifying, right? So if we look at different cereals, we can do wheat, barley, put in lentils and all sorts of pulses in there to keep that rotation very diverse, and having lots of different herbicide opportunities and resistance management opportunities really to go throughout the year. We'll go to the next slide. And this is how I want us to start thinking about our herbicide applications, and that pre-burn and the whole plan is at least 3 years in when you can think of what we're doing pre-seed, what different groups we can add in. If we think of, year 1 with canola, we can have 3 different modes of action in that pre-seed. And then year 2 with wheat, we still have a tank mix with Roundup, but having 2,4-D and some of those different chemistries in there gives us an opportunity to continue mixing even with different tank mixes as well. And then, the opportunities once you get into soybeans or pulses changes yet again. So we're using different tank mix opportunities with a lot of the same efficacy on some of the same target weeds, but a lot of different opportunities within our crops. So being able to keep that fresh and to change it up. And then starting to think throughout the season, each year, how many modes of action are we using? In this case, on our broadleaf weeds, bare minimum, once you do some of these pre-seed tank mixes, you can start with 3, and then you're basically going up from there, minimum 2. But it's quite easy to add a few more modes of action, especially in pre-seed. And just the amount of options that we do have for modes of action can be limited, but when we start tank mixing, it's pretty strong. So even being able to sit and work through your crop rotation in terms of what is this field getting year over year, how many modes of action, is this always going to be effective? Is there anything going down by itself? Is that a risk or vulnerability? And where can we make sure that we don't have that again within that system? So this one, the only one time we have to do is Roundup with canola year 1, right? So the next time we go in with Roundup in season, we can add a tank mix. We can add something else for those in-season weeds that we're targeting in the soybeans because we have that opportunity. Next slide. And the fun part is, a lot of the questions I get is, what do I do about volunteer canola? And when we work on managing our volunteer canola, we inadvertently work on managing our resistance, or when we're being very strong in our resistance management, we are inadvertently managing our volunteer canola very, very well. So this is, again, not the exhaustive list of tank mix partners that you can use to control your volunteer canola. And there's lots of options in front of every crop and in most crops that you can do. And just looking at the variety of the group 14s and 4s and 2s and 6s in that pre-seed burn, there's a lot of different modes of action that we can bring into our strategy and our herbicide management plan. Whether we're going for herbicide resistance or whether we're going for volunteer canola, it's essentially the same practices at the right times. So when we're doing it right, kind of everything gets covered off. Next slide. So I think we've gone through, in terms of the resistance management, really understanding how resistance develops in a field with a different application, and how we're creating that selection pressure with a herbicide, and using that to our advantage, and understanding that if we don't have that same selection pressure, we are avoiding the potential or slowing down a resistance buildup on the farm. And then having the opportunity to spice up our mix and adding that tank mix in there, and to put in more effective modes of action so that never one herbicide is going in alone, and we know that if one fails on it or if one happens to be resistant, that there's another herbicide at that same time to control that weed, so we never have to worry about it setting seed. We never have to look and it escape. If it escapes from one herbicide, that other one's got it at the exact same time. So having that spice up your mix is really having that insurance to make sure that we're not going to have escapes down the line. And then using the opportunity to look at your crop rotation and diversifying it, not only in your crops, which is phenomenal to go through those, to use that as an opportunity to use different tank mixes and different herbicide options, and to keep moving in those different modes of action to take advantage of the different crop tolerances. So using these 3 things, we can really set ourselves up to have a very strong management plan that is beneficial to us from a yield perspective and from a long-term management perspective. Next slide. So going back to spraying early and why are we doing this? And yes, we are managing our resistance, absolutely. But the in-year benefit for us is still having that better weed control, having that greater herbicide efficacy on small weeds, having that better yield, removing weed interference by utilizing that critical weed-free period concept, and making sure that we are protecting the yield when it matters the most. And through this, being able to manage our resistance potential within those fields, making sure that we're using those effective modes of action to the best of our abilities, and having that insurance policy. The next slide. So when we go back and we think about some of our preconceived ideas that I've certainly had by myself as well, and when we think about, maybe we should be waiting for those weeds to get them all, we know that it is the first weeds that do the most yield damage, and that a healthy crop can really outcompete new weeds, so that we are setting that crop up for success and not waiting until it is being damaged before we go in there and do any control. Again, if it seems a little silly to spray when there's nothing there, a lot of those weeds in there are tough to see, especially when you're just doing a drive-by. But when we saw those residual field pictures, there was really nothing there when you're spraying, but they're either tiny, which is a good thing because we can get to those weeds and have full control and not worry about it, or in a lot of cases, we have the opportunity to put in a residual chemistry that can be more effective in that springtime opportunities. We don't need to worry really about recropping restrictions because it's going to be like at least a full season before the next crop goes in there. There's a lot of advantages to using that residual chemistry as early as possible and keeping those weeds down so our crop can keep going. Again, I think it is a little counterintuitive when we talk about removing weeds for their competition in terms of nutrients, sun, and water. We think of those things happening when our crops are larger and when the weeds are larger. But the yield damage is done a lot longer before the crop actually needs to compete, and we know that, so we can take advantage of getting rid of these small weeds earlier on and protecting that yield throughout the entire season by having our timings nailed down. And then, not wanting to turn around and spray right again can't really help too much for that one. But if we do have a good pre-seed program, spraying even before you're seeding so that you don't have to go back in there very soon, and that crop is already taking off once it's seeded, because there's no weed pressure for it to emerge through. It can really start to manage itself and really take over the weed suppression by having that great crop stand too. So we go spray early, and we're going to go spray a tank mix through this. Next slide. Just wanted to thank you for the time. This is my contact information if anyone wants to have any more questions or follow up or anything that we've seen today. For more advice on weed management and volunteer control, and a lot of this stuff can be found on mixitup.ca as well. All of this information is on there. So lots of resources out there. And I think we can go to the next slide, but back to you, Michelle. Time for questions.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, Liz, for the informative presentation. That was really great. You did a great job covering, the many aspects that we need to keep in mind, whether it's mixing versus rotation, and ensuring that we're, using diversified crop rotations, and making use of those residual chemistries, and making sure that we, keep glyphosate around as a valuable tool for our industry. I've got time for a couple questions here, so I'll get into those. The first question I have is, when I'm trying to figure out, or when I've decided to use a tank mix, how do I determine the mixing order?
Okay, there's a lot of different acronyms that we do. It will always be in your crop protection guide, and it depends on what you're mixing in there. One of the latest ones I've heard, which I think is kind of cute, is WHAM legs. So wettable powders first, agitate microcapsule suspension second or third, liquid insolubles, emulsifiable concentrates, glyphosate, and then surfactants last. So that was kind of fun.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. That's, and easy to remember for sure. Are there any other options out there for tank mixing partners in front of different crops?
So, what we managed to show today is probably a small capture of what the potential tank mix partners are out there. And so really going through crop protection guides or talking to a rep, what's more effective in your area. But there are so many out there for different crops, whether it be on the website or just going through different companies.
Great, thanks. I've got one question coming here that we'll try and answer quickly before wrapping up. Any comments on if a grower has Group 2 resistant wild oat issues and what the best route to go might be in the upcoming years?
Yeah, that one's really tough because you don't necessarily have a lot of tank mixing options or a lot of options for wild oats. But if it's Group 2, you still can be able to utilize Group 1s and Group 9s and Group 11s to go through there. And that's either where you start in that layering practices, or you can do an early pre-seed, something with residual, potentially a Group 4 that you're working into the ground is a granular tank mix that we haven't really talked about. Using something like that early on, and then having the Group 1 in season to make sure that it is controlled, and really having a very strict line in terms of what is escapes. And if it's a concern and you're spraying those herbicides already, even crop removal or patch management is what you'd have to go into next if you want to stick with the zero tolerance for moving on.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Again, anybody, if you have any further questions following this presentation, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll connect you with Elizabeth, or you might have caught her email address on the previous slide as well. Feel free to reach out to her. Before we wrap up today, a reminder that this webinar has been approved for 1 credit in crop management. So if you did not submit your CCA number when registering, please email your first and last name and your CCA number to webinars@annexbusinessmedia.com. Further instructions will also be found in our follow-up email, which will hold the recording of the webinar. Thanks again to Liz and to all of the attendees for tuning in to today's webinar. Please don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com/webinars to view all of our previously recorded webinars, today's webinar, and to register for our next 2 resistance management webinars, which are happening on March 25th and April 8th. One last special thanks to Mix It Up by Bayer Crop Science for sponsoring our session today. From seed to harvest, Bayer is focused on delivering top-performing solutions to address some of your toughest farm challenges. Again, thanks for joining us and have a great rest of your day.